The history of a nation is shaped as much by its triumphs as by its shadows, and in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, William L. Shirer meticulously unveils the story of Nazi Germany's ascent to power under Adolf Hitler. The first book in this magnum opus, titled The Rise of Adolf Hitler, draws readers into a stormy era of chaos and ambition, when a fractured Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles and weakened by internal discord, became fertile ground for a dark vision of dominance and redemption. It is here that we begin the narrative of an Austrian-born dreamer, a failed artist with delusions of grandeur, who would soon wield power over one of the most advanced civilizations of the 20th century. On January 30, 1933, a pivotal moment in history unfolded as Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The circumstances that led to this defining event were far from coincidental. Shirer's account dives deep into the despair gripping Germany following World War I. The fragile Weimar Republic, marred by political infighting, economic collapse, and public disillusionment, served as the stage for the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, to emerge from obscurity. Hitler, a man with fiery oratory and a boundless capacity for manipulation, recognized the vulnerability of the German psyche, a psyche longing for stability and pride amid the ruins of defeat. It was not just Germany's misery that forged Hitler's rise, but his calculated exploitation of that misery. Shirer begins this journey by exploring the early life of Adolf Hitler, painting a portrait of a man who might have seemed unremarkable at first glance. Born on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Austria, Hitler's formative years were marked by mediocrity and failure. He was a product of a dysfunctional family, torn between an authoritarian father and a doting mother. Hitler's own ambition of becoming a great artist was thwarted by his rejection from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, an event that seemed to cement his bitterness and sharpen his prejudices. These years of disappointment in Vienna were not just a tale of personal struggle but the birth of his ideology. Shirer carefully unpacks how Vienna, with its teeming masses of various ethnic groups, planted the seeds of Hitler's virulent antisemitism and his obsession with racial purity. As the years unfolded, the fledgling ideas of this young Austrian solidified into a dogma that would later define the Nazi movement. After drifting through a life of vagrancy and menial labor, Hitler's sense of purpose crystallized during World War I. He served as a soldier in the Bavarian army and experienced the trenches of the Western Front. For Hitler, the war was both an awakening and a source of profound disillusionment. Germany's defeat in 1918, which Hitler perceived as a betrayal rather than a military failure, became the cornerstone of his political ideology. He blamed the Jews, Marxists, and those he deemed the November criminals who signed the armistice for the nation's humiliation. This rhetoric of betrayal and revenge became the rallying cry of his future political career. The post-war years found Hitler in Munich, where the seeds of his political ascendance were sown. Germany, reeling from the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, was a fractured society, its economy shattered and its political structure teetering. Shirer vividly describes this as a period ripe for radical voices. Hitler found himself drawn to the German Workers' Party, a small and insignificant group at the time, but one that offered a platform for his burgeoning political ambitions. His ability to command attention through impassioned speeches transformed this obscure party into a growing force. Renaming it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, Hitler began to shape its identity, aligning it with the symbols and slogans that would soon become synonymous with Nazism. Shirer captures the incendiary rise of Hitler with striking clarity, chronicling his efforts to unify Germany's disaffected masses under the Nazi banner. His greatest strength was his oratory, which channeled the despair of a broken nation into a shared vision of revival. Yet, it was not just his words but his calculated actions that propelled him forward. He surrounded himself with like-minded extremists, including figures like Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, who would later play pivotal roles in the Third Reich. Together, they forged a movement that combined nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the promise of restoring German greatness. A defining moment in Hitler's early political career came with the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, an ill-fated coup attempt aimed at overthrowing the Weimar government. Shirer recounts this dramatic episode in detail, showing how its failure did not end Hitler's ambitions, but rather elevated his stature as a nationalist martyr. His subsequent trial gave him a national platform, and his imprisonment offered him the time to pen Mein Kampf, a blueprint of his ideology and a chilling forewarning of what was to come. The book not only detailed his racial theories and vision of a future Germany but also underscored his belief in the power of propaganda and the need for absolute leadership. Shirer's narrative then shifts to the broader socio-political landscape of the late 1920s and early 1930s, a period when Germany's fragile democracy was crumbling under the weight of economic turmoil. The Great Depression hit the country particularly hard, leaving millions unemployed and fostering widespread anger against the ruling class. The Nazis capitalized on this unrest, presenting themselves as saviors who could restore Germany's dignity. Through masterful propaganda and relentless campaigning, they won the hearts and minds of a growing number of Germans. The collapse of the Weimar Republic was as much a result of internal weaknesses as it was the machinations of the Nazi Party. Shirer demonstrates how Hitler skillfully exploited the vulnerabilities of his political opponents, using alliances and betrayals to position himself as Germany's indispensable leader. By January 1933, after a series of backroom deals and underestimations by conservative politicians like Franz von Papen, Hitler was appointed chancellor. It was a turning point that signaled the beginning of the end for German democracy. In Book 1, Shirer lays the foundation for understanding how a man like Hitler could rise to power. His prose captures the tumult of the era, the ambitions and flaws of its key players, and the societal currents that made the unthinkable possible. Through a meticulous examination of both the personal and political, Shirer presents Hitler not as an anomaly but as a product of his time, a man whose rise was shaped by the desperation and despair of an entire nation. The seeds of the Third Reich were sown in these early years, and by the end of this book, the path to dictatorship seems inevitable. As readers turn the page, they are left with an unsettling awareness of how history's greatest tragedies often begin with small, almost imperceptible steps. The transformation of a fragile republic into a totalitarian regime unfolds with chilling inevitability in Book 2, Triumph and Consolidation of the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Here, William L. Shirer chronicles how Adolf Hitler transitioned from a figurehead chancellor in 1933 to the unchallenged Führer of Nazi Germany. The narrative reveals the systematic dismantling of democracy, the imposition of terror, and the cunning machinations that cemented Nazi control over an entire nation. What emerges is not just the story of one man's ambition but an intricate web of fear, propaganda, and complicity that ensnared an entire people. The years between 1933 and 1934 were pivotal in the consolidation of Nazi power. Hitler's rise was not the product of chance. It was the result of strategic manipulation. Upon being appointed chancellor, he faced significant constraints. The Nazis, though influential, did not command an outright majority in the Reichstag, and Hitler's cabinet was dominated by conservatives who naively believed they could control him. But Hitler was not content with sharing power. Within weeks, he began orchestrating a series of moves to neutralize his opponents and seize absolute authority. Shirer's account brings to life the Reichstag fire of February 27, 1933, a critical turning point in the Nazi seizure of power. The fire, which gutted the German parliament building, was immediately blamed on communists, though evidence suggests it may have been a Nazi operation designed to create a pretext for a crackdown. Hitler wasted no time exploiting the situation, pressuring President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. This decree suspended civil liberties, allowing for mass arrests of communists and political dissidents. It was a masterstroke. With one act, Hitler silenced his most dangerous rivals and instilled fear across the political spectrum. The March 1933 elections further cemented Nazi dominance. Although they fell short of a majority, the Nazis, through intimidation and propaganda, secured enough seats to push through the Enabling Act. Shirer captures the gravity of this moment, when the Reichstag effectively voted itself into irrelevance, granting Hitler the power to legislate without parliamentary approval. It was a self-inflicted wound that marked the death of the Weimar Republic. With the Enabling Act in hand, Hitler swiftly outlawed opposition parties, trade unions, and free press, replacing them with Nazi-controlled institutions. But political control alone was not enough for Hitler. Shirer meticulously details how the Nazis turned their attention to German society, seeking to reshape every aspect of life to align with their ideology. The Nazification of Germany was not merely a political project. It was a cultural revolution. Education, media, and even religious institutions were co-opted to serve the Nazi cause. The Hitler Youth became a powerful tool for indoctrinating the next generation, while Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda inundated the populace with messages glorifying the Führer and vilifying the regime's enemies. Amid this consolidation of power, Shirer introduces us to the human cost of Nazi rule. The regime's anti-Semitic agenda, which had been a hallmark of Hitler's rhetoric, began to take concrete form. Jews were systematically excluded from public life through a series of laws that stripped them of their rights and livelihoods. The boycott of Jewish businesses in 1933 and the subsequent Nuremberg laws of 1935 signaled the beginning of a campaign that would culminate in genocide. Shirer's narrative does not shy away from the complicity of ordinary Germans, many of whom either embraced or acquiesced to these measures out of fear, prejudice, or apathy. Within the Nazi Party itself, the consolidation of power was marked by ruthless purges. Shirer devotes significant attention to the Night of the Long Knives, the bloody purge of June 1934 that eliminated Ernst Röhm and other leaders of the SA, the paramilitary wing of the party. Röhm's ambitions for the SA, which he envisioned as a revolutionary army, clashed with the traditional German military and threatened Hitler's alliances with conservative elites. Hitler, ever pragmatic, chose to side with the army and the industrialists, ordering the SS to carry out a wave of assassinations that decimated the SA leadership. This act not only solidified Hitler's control over the Nazi Party, but also won him the loyalty of the German military, a crucial step in his quest for absolute power. By the end of 1934, Hitler had achieved what seemed unthinkable just 2 years earlier. He had become the unchallenged leader of Germany. The death of President Hindenburg in August 1934 provided the final piece of the puzzle. Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, declaring himself Führer and Reich Chancellor. The military, which had previously pledged loyalty to the Constitution, now swore an oath of personal allegiance to Hitler, a move that underscored the complete subjugation of state institutions to the will of one man. Yet Shirer's narrative does not solely dwell on the political and military dimensions of Nazi consolidation. He delves into the psychological mechanisms that enabled this transformation. Propaganda played a central role in creating a cult of personality around Hitler, portraying him as the savior of Germany. The regime's use of spectacle mass rallies, parades, and public ceremonies fostered a sense of unity and purpose among the German people. At the same time, fear was ever present. The Gestapo and SS operated as instruments of terror, ensuring that dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Informants and surveillance created a climate of paranoia, where even private conversations could lead to imprisonment or worse. Shirer's depiction of life in the Third Reich during these years is both vivid and harrowing. He captures the contradictions of a society that, on the surface, seemed to be achieving order and progress, but underneath was rotting from the poison of authoritarianism. The economy, bolstered by rearmament and public works programs, appeared to recover from the depths of the Depression, earning Hitler the admiration of many Germans. But this recovery came at the cost of personal freedoms and was built on unsustainable foundations. As Book 2 concludes, the reader is left with a sense of foreboding. Hitler's grip on Germany is unshakable, and his ambitions extend far beyond its borders. Shirer masterfully sets the stage for the events to come, illustrating how the triumphs of these years were not merely consolidations of power, but preludes to catastrophe. The Nazis had achieved their goals of total control, but the price of their success would soon be paid by Germany and the world. The dark machinery of the Third Reich, meticulously constructed in these early years, was now ready to unleash its full destructive force. The march toward global catastrophe begins in earnest in Book 3, The Road to War of the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. William L. Shirer immerses the reader in the fateful years when Adolf Hitler, emboldened by his consolidation of power and fueled by his insatiable ambition, transformed Nazi Germany into an aggressive war machine. The Third Reich, no longer content with remaking German society, now set its sights on reshaping the map of Europe and beyond. This section of the narrative chronicles the calculated steps by which Hitler maneuvered Germany toward war, exploiting the weakness of his adversaries, the naivety of appeasers, and the fervor of a nation swept up in dreams of expansion. The story begins with Hitler's first steps toward overturning the Treaty of Versailles, a document he viewed as the ultimate symbol of Germany's humiliation. This treaty, which had imposed strict limitations on German rearmament, was gradually dismantled by Hitler through a combination of deception, boldness, and the complacency of other European powers. Shirer captures the audacity of Hitler's moves, the reintroduction of conscription, the expansion of the army, and the construction of an air force, all in open defiance of Versailles. These acts were accompanied by the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, a gambit that could have been thwarted had France or Britain chosen to intervene. Instead, Hitler's gamble paid off, reinforcing his belief that the Western democracies lacked the will to resist him. Shirer's narrative reveals that these moves were not merely tactical but ideological. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people, demanded territorial expansion to the east. This vision, outlined in Mein Kampf, was rooted in a racial hierarchy that saw Slavs as subhuman and destined to serve the German master race. The drive for Lebensraum was not just a strategic goal but a justification for conquest, displacement, and genocide. It became the ideological backbone of Hitler's foreign policy, shaping every decision he made in the years leading up to the Second World War. The first major victim of Hitler's ambitions was Austria. In 1938, the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, was carried out with a mix of coercion and popular support. Shirer details how Hitler manipulated Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, using threats of invasion to force the Austrian government to capitulate. The German army marched into Austria without resistance, greeted by cheering crowds that gave the annexation an air of legitimacy. But behind the jubilation lay the grim reality of Nazi control. Political opponents were arrested, Jewish businesses were looted, and Austria's sovereignty was extinguished. For Hitler, the Anschluss was a personal triumph, a fulfillment of his long-held dream to unite his homeland with Germany. From Austria, Hitler's gaze turned to Czechoslovakia, a nation whose very existence he despised. The Sudetenland, a region with a significant German-speaking population, became the focal point of his aggression. Hitler fomented unrest among the Sudeten Germans, demanding their liberation and the region's incorporation into the Reich. Shirer vividly recounts the diplomatic drama that unfolded, culminating in the infamous Munich Agreement of 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid war, acceded to Hitler's demands, allowing Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a hollow promise of peace. Chamberlain's declaration of peace for our time would soon prove tragically naive, as Hitler saw the Western powers' appeasement as confirmation that he could proceed unchecked. Shirer's portrayal of these events is steeped in irony and foreboding. The Munich Agreement, celebrated at the time as a triumph of diplomacy, was in reality a capitulation that emboldened Hitler and sealed Czechoslovakia's fate. Within months, the remainder of the country was dismembered. In March 1939, German troops occupied Prague, shattering any illusions that Hitler's ambitions were limited to uniting German-speaking peoples. It was now clear that his goals were far more expansive and dangerous. Shirer notes that the occupation of Czechoslovakia marked a turning point, exposing Hitler's true intentions and forcing Britain and France to abandon their policy of appeasement. The final steps on the road to war revolved around Poland, whose independence was guaranteed by Britain and France after the betrayal of Czechoslovakia. Hitler, however, was undeterred. He demanded the return of Danzig and the construction of a German-controlled corridor through Polish territory, claims that Poland resolutely rejected. At the same time, Hitler pursued a shocking diplomatic maneuver, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. This agreement between two ideological enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, stunned the world. Shirer delves into the cynical calculus behind the pact, which provided Germany with a free hand to invade Poland while the Soviets seized their share of Polish territory and prepared for a future confrontation with the West. The Nazi-Soviet Pact was not merely a diplomatic coup but a harbinger of doom. It cleared the way for the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, an act of aggression that triggered Britain and France's declarations of war. Shirer's account of these final days of peace is filled with tension and inevitability, as the world teetered on the brink of a conflict that would consume it for 6 years. The German Blitzkrieg, a lightning-fast military strategy, overwhelmed Poland in a matter of weeks, demonstrating the terrifying effectiveness of Hitler's war machine. In Book 3, Shirer meticulously documents the steps that led to World War II, revealing how Hitler's cunning, aggression, and ideological fervor were matched by the failures of his adversaries to confront him when they had the chance. The narrative is both an indictment of appeasement and a chilling reminder of how ambition, unchecked and underestimated, can plunge the world into chaos. By the end of this section, the stage is set for a global conflagration, with Hitler firmly in command of a Germany ready to unleash its full destructive potential. Shirer's portrayal of these years captures the relentless momentum toward war, driven by one man's vision and a world's failure to stop him. The world plunged into chaos as Hitler unleashed his war machine in Book 4, War, Early Victories and the Turning Point of the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. William L. Shirer's account vividly captures the rapid expansion of Nazi Germany's power, the early triumphs of its military strategies, and the dramatic shift in the tide of war. This phase, spanning the opening years of World War II, unfolds like a series of unrelenting storms, each meticulously planned and devastating in execution, until the limits of Hitler's hubris begin to reveal themselves. The war began on September 1, 1939, when German forces invaded Poland in a ferocious display of speed and coordination. This new form of warfare, known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, stunned the world. Poland's defenses, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, crumbled in a matter of weeks. Shirer details how this overwhelming success was achieved through the combined use of tanks, motorized infantry, and air power, coordinated with brutal precision. The invasion was not just a military campaign but a harbinger of the horrors to come, as Nazi forces implemented ruthless policies of occupation, targeting Poland's Jewish population and intellectual elite. By the end of September, Poland was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union, fulfilling the secret terms of the Nazi-Soviet Pact and setting the stage for further aggression. While Poland's fate shocked the world, the Western Front remained eerily quiet. Shirer captures this surreal interlude, the so-called Sitzkrieg or phony war, during which Britain and France, though technically at war with Germany, took little action. Hitler, meanwhile, used this period to consolidate his gains and plan his next moves. His strategy was not merely to expand territory but to shatter the illusion of Allied strength and resolve. The Western democracies, still reeling from the First World War, hesitated, hoping against hope that the conflict might somehow be contained. The spring of 1940 shattered those hopes. Hitler launched a series of swift and devastating campaigns that brought Western Europe to its knees. Shirer meticulously recounts the invasion of Denmark and Norway in April, a bold operation designed to secure strategic ports and prevent a British blockade. These conquests marked the first major use of German paratroopers and demonstrated the Reich's ability to strike with speed and surprise. Norway's resistance, though spirited, was ultimately overwhelmed, and by June, the country was under Nazi control. The real shock, however, came in May 1940, with the German invasion of Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Shirer's narrative captures the brilliance of the Blitzkrieg strategy, which exploited weaknesses in the Allied defenses. The Germans bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by advancing through the Ardennes, a region thought to be impassable by tanks. The speed and ferocity of the German advance trapped Allied forces, leading to the dramatic evacuation of Dunkirk, where hundreds of thousands of British and French troops narrowly escaped annihilation. Within weeks, Paris fell, and France, the proud victor of the First World War, capitulated to Nazi Germany. The French defeat was more than a military disaster. It was a psychological blow that left Britain standing alone against the Reich. Shirer's portrayal of these events conveys the sense of inevitability that gripped Europe as one country after another succumbed to Nazi power. Hitler, at the height of his triumph, seemed unstoppable. Yet, as Shirer observes, these early victories were not just a testament to German military might but also to the failure of Allied leadership. The complacency and disorganization of Britain and France had handed Hitler his greatest triumphs, and the world now faced the grim reality of a Europe dominated by the Third Reich. Despite these victories, Hitler's ambition remained insatiable. His next target was Britain, the last remaining obstacle to total dominance in Western Europe. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was a bold and audacious undertaking, but it ultimately failed to materialize. Shirer delves into the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. German Luftwaffe bombers sought to cripple British defenses and morale, but the Royal Air Force, aided by advanced radar technology and the indomitable spirit of the British people, repelled the assault. Hitler's failure to subdue Britain marked the first major setback of the war, forcing him to reconsider his strategy and turn his gaze elsewhere. In 1941, Hitler embarked on his most ambitious and catastrophic campaign, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Shirer's account of this monumental undertaking is both dramatic and harrowing. Hitler's ideological hatred for Bolshevism and his desire for Lebensraum drove him to break the Nazi-Soviet pact and launch an attack on a scale never before seen in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, poured into Soviet territory, achieving initial success against a poorly prepared Red Army. Cities like Kiev and Smolensk fell, and German forces advanced to the outskirts of Moscow. Yet the campaign, initially hailed as another triumph of Blitzkrieg, soon revealed its flaws. Shirer captures the turning points: the vastness of the Soviet landscape, the harshness of the Russian winter, and the resilience of Soviet resistance. Hitler's refusal to allow strategic retreats and his underestimation of Soviet resources and resolve turned what had seemed like a sure victory into a grueling quagmire. By the end of 1941, the German advance had stalled, and the tide of war began to shift. While the Eastern Front consumed Germany's resources, the United States entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Shirer examines the significance of America's entry into the conflict, which transformed the war into a truly global struggle. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, an impulsive and strategically questionable move, brought the full industrial and military might of America against the Axis powers. Germany, once the aggressor, now faced a two-front war against formidable enemies. Shirer masterfully balances the grand sweep of military strategy with the human cost of war. He details the suffering inflicted by Nazi occupation, from the brutal exploitation of conquered territories to the early stages of the Holocaust. The systematic extermination of Jews, political dissidents, and other undesirables began to take shape during these years, though the full extent of the final solution had yet to unfold. The war was not just a clash of armies but an unprecedented assault on humanity itself. By the end of Book 4, the narrative has reached a critical juncture. Germany's early victories, though dazzling, have come at a tremendous cost. Hitler's overreach and the resilience of his adversaries foreshadow the challenges to come. The tide of war, once firmly in Germany's favor, has begun to turn, and the cracks in the Nazi war machine are starting to show. Shirer's account leaves readers with a sense of foreboding, as the seeds of both triumph and disaster have been sown. The world, engulfed in flames, braces for the next act of this harrowing drama. The momentum of history is unforgiving, and in Book 5, beginning of the end of the rise and fall of the Third Reich, William L. Shirer masterfully chronicles the unraveling of the Nazi dream of domination. By 1942, the tide of war began to turn decisively against Adolf Hitler and his Reich. What had started as a meteoric ascent, characterized by lightning victories and an aura of invincibility, now began its slow and inevitable descent into ruin. Shirer paints these years as a grim paradox. While the Nazis tightened their grip on occupied Europe, their grasp on the war itself began to slip. The book opens with Hitler's ambition still burning as fiercely as ever. The new order he envisioned for Europe was now being imposed upon millions of subjugated people. Shirer lays bare the brutal machinery of Nazi occupation, which sought not only to exploit the economic resources of conquered territories but to remake them entirely. Hitler's vision for this new order was one of unrelenting oppression, centered on racial hierarchy and the systematic eradication of undesirables. The occupied lands were drained of their wealth and manpower, their industries geared toward feeding the German war machine, while their populations were terrorized into submission. Resistance movements sprang up across Europe, from the forests of Poland to the streets of Paris, but their efforts, though courageous, were no match for the ruthless efficiency of the Gestapo and the SS. Amid this backdrop of oppression, Shirer introduces one of the most significant turning points of the war, the Battle of Stalingrad. By 1942, the German army had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, seeking to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and deliver a final blow to Soviet resistance. Stalingrad became the focal point of this campaign, and Shirer spares no detail in describing the ferocity of the battle. The city, reduced to rubble by relentless German bombing, became a symbol of Soviet defiance. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army fought to halt the Nazi advance. Hitler, obsessed with taking the city that bore Stalin's name, refused to allow his forces to retreat, even as they became encircled and cut off from supplies. The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked a seismic shift in the war. For the first time, the aura of Nazi invincibility was shattered. Shirer captures the profound psychological and strategic impact of this defeat, both on the German military and the home front. Stalingrad was not merely a loss of men and material, it was a catastrophic blow to German morale and a turning point that emboldened the Allies. The war, once driven by German initiative, now began to slip from Hitler's control. As the Eastern Front collapsed into chaos, Shirer shifts his focus to the Mediterranean theater, where another key defeat further weakened the Axis powers. The Allied victory at El Alamein in North Africa, led by Britain's General Montgomery, ended the German advance toward the Suez Canal and secured vital supply routes for the Allies. Shortly after, American and British forces launched Operation Torch, landing in French North Africa and forcing the Axis into retreat. These campaigns, though geographically distant from Germany, chipped away at the Reich's ability to maintain its stranglehold on Europe. Italy, too, began to crumble under the weight of Allied advances. Shirer recounts the dramatic fall of Benito Mussolini in 1943, a moment that symbolized the weakening Axis alliance. Mussolini, once a close ally of Hitler, was deposed and arrested following the Allied invasion of Sicily. Though German forces moved swiftly to occupy northern Italy and install Mussolini as the puppet leader of a fascist republic, the collapse of Italy as a reliable partner further isolated Nazi Germany. The Reich, which had once seemed destined to dominate Europe, now found itself increasingly alone. Within Germany, cracks in the Nazi regime began to appear. Shirer vividly describes the July 20, 1944, plot to assassinate Hitler, a desperate attempt by a group of German officers to end the war and save their country from complete destruction. The plot, centered around a bomb planted by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, nearly succeeded. Hitler survived the explosion by sheer luck. Shirer details the aftermath of the failed coup, as the SS unleashed a wave of brutal reprisals. Hundreds of conspirators and suspected sympathizers were executed, and the regime's grip tightened even as its power waned. The plot revealed the growing disillusionment within the German military and political elite, even as the broader population remained trapped in a web of propaganda and fear. Shirer does not neglect the human cost of the war during these years. The Holocaust, already underway, reached its grim crescendo as Nazi policies of extermination became industrialized. The death camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor operated with chilling efficiency, systematically murdering millions of Jews, Roma, and other targeted groups. Shirer's account of this genocide is unflinching, a necessary reminder of the moral abyss into which the Third Reich had plunged. Even as the war turned against them, the Nazis diverted vital resources to their campaign of mass murder, a testament to the pathological hatred that underpinned their ideology. By 1944, the Allies had turned the tide of war decisively against Germany. Shirer describes the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, as a masterstroke of planning and coordination. The successful landing of Allied forces on the beaches of France marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. As American, British, and Canadian troops pushed inland, the German army found itself fighting a desperate and losing battle on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front had become a nightmare, with the Red Army driving relentlessly westward, while the Western Front collapsed under the weight of Allied advances. In Book 5, Shirer captures the mounting desperation of the Third Reich as the walls closed in. Hitler's leadership, once marked by calculated risk-taking, now descended into delusion and irrationality. His refusal to countenance retreat or negotiation condemned Germany to destruction. The Nazi regime, which had risen on a tide of nationalist fervor and military triumph, now faced annihilation at the hands of the very forces it had sought to dominate. The reader is left with a sense of grim inevitability. The events chronicled in this section mark the beginning of a cataclysmic unraveling, as the Reich's hubris and brutality sowed the seeds of its destruction. Shirer's account of this period is a powerful testament to the resilience of the Allies, the courage of resistance movements, and the horrors of a regime that sought to reshape the world through violence and hate. The Reich was faltering, but the final collapse, as Shirer ominously foreshadows, would come at a terrible cost. The end of a 1,000-year Reich that lasted only 12 years unfolds with tragic inevitability in Book 6. The Fall of the Third Reich, of the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. William L. Shirer brings us into the grim final act of Adolf Hitler's reign, where his once triumphant empire crumbles under the weight of its hubris, its atrocities, and the overwhelming force of its enemies. This section is a study in collapse, tracing the disintegration of Nazi Germany from its failed last offensives to the chaotic ruins of Berlin, where Hitler's grandiose ambitions meet their ignoble end. By early 1945, the writing was on the wall for the Third Reich. The Allies were closing in on Germany from all sides. In the east, the Soviet Red Army surged relentlessly forward, sweeping through Poland and into the heart of Germany. The horrors of their advance reflected the vengeance of a people brutalized by years of Nazi aggression. Entire cities were razed, and the German population, once complicit or passive in the face of Hitler's crimes, now found themselves victims of unimaginable violence. In the West, British and American forces had breached the Siegfried Line and were advancing across the Rhine. The Nazi military machine, stretched to its breaking point, could do little more than delay the inevitable. Shirer's narrative captures the desperation and delusion of the Nazi leadership during these final months. Hitler, holed up in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, refused to accept the reality of the situation. He clung to fantasies of last-minute victories and secret weapons that would turn the tide of the war. Orders were issued to non-existent armies. Entire divisions were sacrificed in futile gestures. His once fearsome generals, who had carried out his bold and devastating strategies in the early years of the war, now found themselves berated for failures they could not prevent. Some, like Heinrich Himmler, sought to negotiate their own survival with the Allies, while others, like Albert Speer, began to recognize the collapse of the regime they had served. Shirer vividly recounts the devastation wrought by the Allied bombings of German cities. Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin became infernos as the relentless air raids reduced them to rubble. The civilian population, once swept up in the fervor of Nazi propaganda, now faced the consequences of Hitler's ambitions. Hunger, homelessness, and despair became daily realities. Yet even as the Reich disintegrated, the Nazi regime continued to enforce its will with ruthless efficiency. The Gestapo hunted down dissenters, while the SS carried out executions of those deemed traitors. In these final days, the Nazis' cruelty seemed to intensify, as though their impending doom demanded an even greater sacrifice of human life. Amid this collapse, Shirer introduces us to the final futile maneuvers of the German military. The Ardennes Offensive, or the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last desperate gamble to halt the Allied advance in the West. Though initially successful in catching the Allies off guard, the offensive quickly ran out of steam. American forces, bolstered by superior logistics and air power, turned the tide, and the Germans were forced into a hasty retreat. The battle marked the last significant Nazi offensive of the war, leaving Germany's western defenses in tatters. In the east, the Soviet advance was relentless and merciless. Shirer describes the fall of Budapest, Vienna, and finally Berlin, where the Red Army engaged in some of the most brutal urban combat of the war. The battle for Berlin was not just a military struggle but a symbolic one. The city, once the proud capital of the Reich, became a wasteland of rubble and death. Hitler, surrounded by the remnants of his inner circle, retreated further into his delusions. He railed against his generals, blamed the German people for their failure to achieve his vision, and issued orders that were either ignored or impossible to carry out. As Soviet forces closed in, he refused to flee, choosing instead to remain in his bunker and face what he saw as his destiny. The climax of Shirer's narrative is Hitler's final days in the Führer bunker. The once dominant figure of German power and ambition had become a shadow of his former self, physically frail, paranoid, and consumed by despair. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops stormed through the streets of Berlin, Hitler took his own life alongside his wife, Eva Braun, whom he had married just hours earlier. His death marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime, though the fighting continued for several more days. Shirer captures the eerie and pathetic atmosphere of the bunker, where loyalty to Hitler persisted even as the world above collapsed into chaos. With Hitler gone, the Third Reich disintegrated completely. Shirer recounts the final days of the war, as German forces surrendered piecemeal to the advancing Allies. On May 7, 1945, Germany formally capitulated, bringing an end to a war that had claimed tens of millions of lives and left Europe in ruins. The aftermath was one of reckoning. Shirer describes the Allied occupation of Germany, the division of the country into zones of control, and the beginnings of the Nuremberg trials, where the surviving Nazi leadership was held accountable for their crimes. The trials, Shirer notes, were not just about justice but about documenting the horrors of the Nazi regime so that the world might never forget. In these closing pages, Shirer reflects on the legacy of the Third Reich. He does not simply recount its collapse but explores the factors that allowed it to rise in the first place. The desperation of post-World War I Germany, the failure of democratic institutions, and the seductive power of propaganda. The lessons are clear but sobering, as Shirer warns that the conditions that gave birth to Nazism could arise again if the world does not remain vigilant. Book 6 is a harrowing conclusion to a monumental narrative. It lays bare the fragility of empires built on hatred, violence, and lies. The fall of the Third Reich is not just the story of a regime's destruction but a testament to the resilience of those who resisted it and the tragic cost of its rise to power. Shirer's account leaves readers with a profound sense of both closure and unease, as the ashes of the Reich serve as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both greatness and destruction. The story of Nazi Germany may have ended, but its lessons endure, a warning to future generations to guard against the forces of tyranny and fanaticism. In the brief epilogue of the rise and fall of the Third Reich, William L. Shirer offers a sobering reflection on the unprecedented devastation caused by Nazi Germany and the lessons its rise and fall leave for future generations. Shirer underscores the catastrophic consequences of Hitler's regime, which left tens of millions dead, including 6 million Jews systematically murdered in the Holocaust. Europe was reduced to ruins, its cities and infrastructure devastated, and its social fabric torn apart. The Nazi regime's crimes, rooted in racial hatred, totalitarian control, and a ruthless drive for conquest, are presented as unparalleled in modern history, marking the Third Reich as a grim warning of the dangers of unchecked power and ideological fanaticism. Shirer examines the conditions that allowed the Nazi regime to come to power, such as the despair of post-World War I Germany, the economic collapse of the Great Depression, and the complacency or complicity of other nations in the face of Hitler's aggression. He highlights how the failure of democratic institutions, the allure of authoritarian leadership, and the willingness of a populace to embrace scapegoats contributed to the horrors that followed. The epilogue also reflects on the global response to the Reich's collapse, particularly the trials at Nuremberg, which sought to hold Nazi leaders accountable and document their crimes for posterity. Shirer concludes with a cautionary note. The rise of the Third Reich is not an anomaly but a stark reminder that such forces can re-emerge if the world becomes complacent. The epilogue serves as a final indictment of tyranny and a call to vigilance, urging future generations to guard against the forces of hate, dictatorship, and the abandonment of humanity's moral responsibilities.